Welcome to the Bible in a Year podcast, a resource from Enter the Bible. Journey with us through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. I'm Catherine Schifferdecker.
And I'm Jenny Wojciechowski, Assistant Professor of Church History at Luther Seminary.
And today we're joined by one of our friends and colleagues, Professor Cameron Howard. Cameron is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary. Thanks for joining us, Cameron.
Thanks for having me.
So today, this episode is on the book of Exodus, which is one of those big books, both big in terms of the number of chapters, but also big in the imagination of the biblical writers. And of course, if people don't know any other book of the Bible, they may know stories from the book of Exodus. So Cameron is going to help us take a dive into the book of Exodus. And as always, we invite our listeners and our viewers to read for yourselves, to enter the Bible, as the title of our website says, Enter the Bible. So, Cameron, at the book of Exodus, can you give us a quick summary or outline of this book?
Sure. I mean, it's a little bit tricky just because there's so much in there, and this book does kind of loom large both over the rest of the books of the Bible into the New Testament, in Jewish tradition and in Christian tradition. It really is a kind of fundamental part of the biblical story. So it opens with the Israelites in Egypt, and it really dovetails on the book of Genesis. So it can be helpful to sort of revisit the end of Genesis and remember that Joseph had risen to leadership in Egypt, and his family had joined him there, and hundreds of years have passed, and the Israelites have multiplied and are a significant population in Egypt. And then it tells us in Exodus that a new king arose who did not know Joseph. And so the fortunes of the Hebrew people in Egypt have changed from this prosperity to slavery. So Exodus is about their journey out of slavery and then into this revitalized relationship with the God of Israel, the God who calls them out. So we start in slavery. God raises up this leader, Moses, to help bring them out of slavery. Pharaoh refuses to let them go, so there's a series of plagues, but eventually Pharaoh's army is defeated at the Red Sea when the waters part. The Israelites go through on dry ground and begin their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So that wandering is going to continue past Exodus. However, the rest of Exodus is about that journey, except that they then sort of park themselves at Sinai, at the mountain, for much of the second half of Exodus, then to receive the law at Sinai. And so the narrative portion sort of slows down and enters into a time of law giving when the people receive the law. And so Exodus from 1920-ish on through is just telling us those laws mostly that are received there.
Thanks, Cameron. So what's a good way into this book?
Well, I think that as biblical books go, this is one that's actually pretty good for starting at the beginning because the story is quite gripping. There's a lot of drama. And so it's not one that, starts, it's not like First Chronicles that starts with 9 chapters of genealogies. So you wouldn't want to start at the beginning of that one. There's action at the beginning. But I also think it can be helpful as you start at the beginning to pay attention to the character God. That is, what is God doing? So I think in popular culture, think about the sort of epic movies made about the book of Exodus, like the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston as Moses, or the Prince of Egypt. Those really kind of center Moses as the main character. But I think that God is the main character of the book of Exodus. And so if you were to start your reading by thinking, what is it that God is doing? Where is God sort of out of the picture? And when does God come into the picture? That can be a really interesting way to start making connections between our sense of theology today and the kind of epic story that the book is telling.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about that book. So what kind of book is this? What genre would it fit into?
Well, that's also a place that Exodus is bigger than just one answer to that kind of question, because it is narrative. It is telling a story. However, that story includes in it, as I mentioned, this time of receiving the law. And so then the action stops in the sense of like, where's the next movement through the wilderness? And instead we get a story of the law giving that contains lots of laws embedded in it. So it is narrative, but it is also law. And of course, it has a little bit of poetry in there too. The Song of the Sea, after the Israelites cross the sea, is a poem. And so it is a story, but I wouldn't want us to forget that it's not just a story, that there are other kinds of texts that are embedded in there and that come together so that you can't really pull them apart. It's not just law either. It's like all this kind of folded together.
Yeah, that I think people are probably surprised when they read Exodus. So like I said at the beginning, if a person doesn't know any other story in the Bible, they may know this one, right? Partly because of those movies that you mentioned, right? So my generation or before, right? The 10 Commandments, though I watched it in reruns, I'll say that, every Holy Week, right? You had Charlton Heston, or for my kids' generation, the Prince of Egypt. And because that story has reverberated so much throughout Christian and Jewish history, right? Like inspiring people like Martin Luther King Jr. and others and liberation theologians. But that story really ends by chapter 20, as you said, right, with the giving of the 10 Commandments. And then you have the whole second half of the book that is mostly the giving of the law. So, it's I think, not widely known that there are so many kind of regulations and the instructions about building the tabernacle and then the building of the tabernacle and all of that.
Right. Yeah. So some of the laws are the things we're familiar with, like the 10 Commandments, or what you do if your ox gores somebody, or things like that.
Right.
But then there's also just this very long multi-chapter portion that's about the furnishings of the tabernacle, how to build the tabernacle being the traveling tent shrine that goes with the Israelites through the wilderness. Yeah, that, is not the most exciting part. Maybe the book does not end as exciting as it ends. But of course, the amount of time devoted to that also testifies to how important that was in ancient Israelite religion, a sense of having God's presence in the community and a place for God to dwell among the people.
Yeah. All right. We've come to our favorite portion of, or one of our favorite portions of these sessions, these episodes, where we were at Bible Bingo. So if you were playing a game of bingo with the book of Exodus as the topic, what would be on your bingo card, Cameron? What words or phrases or themes would be on your bingo card for the book of Exodus?
Well, my number one word would be slavery, though really this is kind of easier to see in Hebrew, but anytime you're reading in English and you come across the word slavery, service, or work, or labor, those are usually all using the same Hebrew word that means all of those things. And the Hebrews are freed in Exodus from service to Pharaoh to service to God. And so there is this sense of doing work for or being under the command of Pharaoh in the first third of the book, and then under God's command, working or living for God. And so, and in Hebrew, that word is the same, that kind of like enslavement and also the sort of worship and service to God. So I think it's important for that reason. And also the fact of slavery, that remember you were slaves in the land of Egypt, is a refrain throughout the Old Testament that's so important. In the book of Deuteronomy in particular, it becomes very important. Why are you keeping the Sabbath? Because you were slaves and God led you out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And so the whole orientation of ancient Israel to work and community and life together is defined by remembering that time of servitude and remembering liberation from it. And that is supposed to be definitive for the life of community together, not to be like Pharaoh.
Yeah, that's such an important point to remember. That you're right, that refrain, remember that you were slaves, so don't treat other people as Pharaoh treated you. And also, the Hebrew slaves aren't set free to do whatever they want. They're set free to be servants or even slaves of the Lord. So yeah, good bingo term. All right, your next one you said was Moses. Why Moses?
Yeah, so even though I try to say he wasn't the main character of Exodus, he's still very important.
Still very important. Yeah.
Yeah.
A major supporting actor.
Yes. Who is the one who is a prophet that is an intermediary between the divine and the human. And so God communicates with the people of Israel in Exodus through this Moses. So it's not only his sort of dramatic showdowns with Pharaoh, but then also when you get to the law-giving portion of Exodus, just pay attention to how much Moses goes up and down that mountain. Moses went up the mountain. Moses came down the mountain. Sometimes in the text, he comes down like twice in a row without telling us that he had gone back up. So Moses has an important role to play, of course, in the book of Exodus, and he comes up a lot. We would have to call out Moses for bingo.
All right. Go ahead, Jenny.
I was going to say, as a non-Bible expert, something I always thought about Moses is he seems really weary through the text. Is that a good reading of this?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Like he doesn't want to do it in the first place. He doesn't want to be this leader. He objects. I remember counting once.
I think five times or something.
Yeah, is it five times?
I think so, yeah.
Send somebody else. This is why I'm not qualified. And then everybody knows that if you are triangulated, right? If you're in a communication triangle, you're the third there. That's exhausting. God's talking to Moses. The people are talking to Moses, but the people and God aren't really talking to each other. And so Moses is stuck in the middle. And that's hard work. And then, of course, spoiler, in Deuteronomy, he's not going to be able even to enter the promised land after all of this work. So it's a hard role to play. And he does show his exhaustion throughout.
All right. The third term on your bingo card is the personal name of God revealed to Moses at the bush. What do you want to say?
Right. So the way that we spell it out in English is YHWH. In Jewish tradition, the name of God is not pronounced. In some Christian traditions and in academic discourse, it is pronounced as Yahweh, but that's we don't know that that's exactly how to say it. Anyway, the divine name is revealed in Exodus 3 because Moses says, who do I tell, when I go to my people and say, the God of your ancestors sent me, what is his name? And the response from God is, well, I am who I am. I will be what I will be. It's very mysterious. And then in a sort of contraction of that response, we get these 4 letters that in English are YHWH. And so not only is God the main character, but then God is given a particular name and understood particularly in relationship with this people, Israel. Because in the ancient Near East, every people, every little city-state had their god or gods who were supposed to be their champions, And so if it went well with your god and your little city-state, then it would go well. That is, if your God was winning in the battles in the heavens, then you were probably winning on earth. There was the sense of a sort of patronage or a supporting God. And so the gods of all the regions have their names, like Baal or Marduk or
Marduk.
whoever
Mm-hmm.
your
Mm-hmm.
particular God is. And so in Exodus 3, you have established that this is the God of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And then what the Bible will go on to do is to say not only is the God of Israel the best God, but the God of Israel is the only God. And that's a sort of
Mm-hmm.
bigger part of the Old Testament. But it's really important that here in Exodus 3, and then sort of reiterated again in Exodus 6, is that there is a God who has called Israel into relationship, and that is
Mm-hmm.
this particular God. And so those four
Mm-hmm.
letters, YHWH, the tetragrammaton, we call it sometimes, in your English Bibles is going to be written as Lord in capital letters. And so whenever you see Lord in capital letters, that's actually, again, out of deference to the Jewish tradition, which doesn't write out or pronounce the divine name, your translations are going to render the name of God with Lord in capital letters. But it's helpful to remember that there's a particularity to it. It's not a generic
Mm-hmm.
name for God, but that Lord in capital
Right.
letters is the name of the God of Israel.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Cameron.
That is.
All right, your fourth term is Sinai.
Sinai is the mountain where Moses goes up and down all the time to get the law for the people. And the people are there at Sinai. So Sinai is the setting for 2/3 of the book of Exodus and is the just traditionally associated with the giving of the law.
Perfect. And finally, your final term for your bingo card is tabernacle.
So again, acknowledging that a lot of Exodus is devoted to the instructions for the tabernacle and then the implementation of those instructions for building the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a tent shrine that would travel with the people. And the idea was that God would dwell in that tabernacle among the people. And that's where the priests would go to offer sacrifices for the people. And then that's sort of the model, at least in the order of the narrative, the model for the temple that would then be in Jerusalem. But of course, they don't have a temple yet because, as the story goes, right, they're still making their way from Egypt to the Promised Land. And so eventually the temple will be built to sort of the specifications of the tabernacle, although it's much more likely that the temple itself was built and then the tabernacle specifications were written after that to sort of foreshadow.
Oh, that's
I've
interesting.
heard, I think some of my own seminary teachers talked about the tabernacle as kind of a portable Mount Sinai, right? As they had to leave Mount Sinai to go towards the Promised Land, the tabernacle was that place where God revealed God's self and was present with the people as at Mount Sinai. I kind of like that definition of the tabernacle as well, or that idea about the tabernacle. But yeah, all important terms. So this has been Bible Bingo. Thank you for playing.
All right. Then we are back to the regular questions. So, what verses, chapters, or passages are particularly memorable in this book?
So I think that my Bible bingo words did not do justice to the importance of women in the narrative of Exodus.
Yeah.
I would want you to be sure to read chapter 1. I'm telling you, there's great stuff right at the beginning of Exodus when the midwives to the Hebrews save the Hebrew babies by defying Pharaoh. So I guess for this particular portion of questions, I can't give you my 20-minute lecture on Exodus 1. But it's a great
I'm afraid
story. And there's more material on Enter the Bible about that story. And also, I'm sure on Working Preacher, we have lots of content about Exodus 1 and some of these other passages. But the importance of the Hebrew midwives' resistance against Pharaoh's edict to kill all the baby boys. That's right in Exodus 1. I think it's always good to read Exodus 20, which is the chapter with the 10 Commandments in it, because often the 10 Commandments have kind of become, ironically, a kind of icon or sort of, dare I say, idol, sometimes sort of set apart from the other, in rabbinic tradition, there's 613 laws in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. It's not just these 10. And so sometimes it's a surprise to read Exodus 20 and find out that, the 10 Commandments are sort of set apart. They're not counted so that different traditions have different ways of numbering the 10 Commandments. You can read it and see what you think about how they should be numbered. But also that you're going to find the ritual Decalogue. So you're going to find another place where there's a set of 10 laws in Exodus, but they're not the 10 Commandments from Exodus 20. They're about sort of sacrifice. And then you can find the 10 Commandments again in Deuteronomy 5, and they're mostly the same, but there's a difference in the rationale for the Sabbath. So the idea of the 10 Commandments is at once a distinct thing in the Bible, but also there are variations on that theme. So that's something to discover and to think about as well.
So a little fuzzier than people might think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they're certainly there, and they're referred to later on as the 10 words. But when you find them in Exodus 20, there's no sort of great introduction. These are the 10 Commandments. Number 1, do this. It's not the same kind of list. And I think that the idea of the rationale, it's not just for some of them. There's not just the thou shalt or thou shalt not, but that this is why you do this. This is the nature of God. This is some detail about the relationship between God and Israel as well. So, and then also the crossing of the sea at Exodus 14. That is, again, if we're talking about action, that's where the action is for getting across on dry ground. And so, again, if you are familiar with Exodus from popular culture, reading Exodus 14 and comparing and contrasting what it says there to how it's depicted is always an interesting exercise. What do interpreters choose to lift up, and what do they leave out?
Fun fact, Benjamin Franklin wanted to put that on our currency.
Really?
The crossing of the Red Sea?
Yep, the parting of the Red
Really?
Sea. Yes, he did.
Cool. That's
interesting.
very interesting.
History
Coming
moment.
from our historian. Yeah. Didn't, some of the early founding fathers compared themselves to Moses. Am I right about that, Jenny?
That I don't know, but I think it was sort of like this grand experiment, this promised land. There's always been sort of this, idea of a promised people here in American culture as well. But that could be a whole nother podcast, not actually related to the Bible.
Well, good. All right, Cameron, next question. Why is Exodus important for Christian life and theology?
Gosh. Well, for a lot of reasons that we have already said, I think the way that it's foundational for understanding much of the rest of the Old Testament, that this experience shadows the rest of the Old Testament, so that then when the Israelites are sent into exile in 586 BCE and around there, they go to Babylon, and then some of the texts that talk about then return from exile will draw on this Exodus story as well. Mm-hmm. That the return from exile is sort of a second Exodus. You get some of that in Isaiah, for example. So you just can't get away from it. And then also, of course, the question of the law and what it means to follow the law. So one thing I think that's really important for Christians always to remember is that the law is a living and life-giving practice for Jews. So it is not sort of something that once was a thing and now it's obsolete. That it's really important to acknowledge that the law is a place of encounter with God in Jewish tradition. And while Christian theology has sometimes downplayed the importance of the law or sometimes just sort of rejected it altogether, I think it's important to see that Jesus is doing what Jewish interpreters were already doing at the time of Jesus and have continued to do, and Christian interpreters have continued to do, which is to reinterpret the law for a new day. So the law is, on the one hand, very much contextualized for its ancient place and time. You can't just sort of bring every part of the law into the 21st century and have an immediate answer for every question, right? It requires interpretation, and it requires sort of thinking about what are some of the scientific things we know now that weren't known in the giving of the law, and how do we get from A to B in that regard. But Jesus is already doing that, right? He comes not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, and that there is an embrace of the law, but also a reinterpretation of the law for a new day. And we continue to do that too, to try to understand, well, what from Jesus's time doesn't give us a sort of easy analogy into the present day, and how do we rethink that, sort of knowing what we know now and putting that with our best interpretations of the ancient text. It's not that the law just was and is over, but the law is always guiding us in new ways. It guided Jesus in new ways, and then we use Jesus's thoughts on the law to guide us in new ways. So we're part of a stream. It's not just a stoppage like that the law ends. So yeah, I think that's really important.
That's a really beautiful way to put that. Now, what is one key theme you would want people to look for as they enter into this book?
I've mentioned some of this already, but I just think that in today's world, we are so obsessed with like the grind and the hustle and productivity, producing things, making things, accounting for your time, not wanting to be seen as lazy, or I don't know. I think that we have this sort of obsession with work, and it is such a fundamental biblical value to cease from work one day a week. I mean, the Sabbath is a defining practice for the people of Israel, and it's rooted in this experience of slavery and liberation. And so I would hope that people would pay attention to that as they read and reflect on, again, this interpreting of the law for a new context and a new day. But what does that mean, that value that's placed not only on working, and there is a high value put on working, and in the ancient world, you had to work just to like make it through the day, right? It took something like 6 hours to get from flour to bread every day. But so work was always important, but it was also important to rest and to see your 6 days as enough, and that rest is part of the provision of God.
That's lovely. That's really lovely. All right, last question. Describe the book of Exodus in 7 words or less, Cameron.
God makes a way out of no way. Hyphenated no way. So it would be 7 words, but I think that's grammatically appropriate anyway. But yeah, that things seem impossible in Exodus, not only being in slavery, not only coming to the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army right behind, but also being thirsty and hungry in the wilderness, and there's nowhere to find water and food, and there's water in a rock and manna from heaven. And even in the giving of the law, like, how do you take this people who have escaped hundreds of years of slavery and find a new life and community together? And the law is a gift toward that. So when things seem impossible, God makes a way.
That's beautiful. God makes a way out of no way. Well, thank you so much, Cameron, for helping introduce us to the book of Exodus, this hugely important book in both Jewish and Christian theology. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
And to those of you who are listening or watching, thank you for joining us. This has been the Bible in a Year podcast from Enter the Bible. Check out more great resources on the Bible at enterthebible.org. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, we appreciate you joining us. You can get more great resources like this, conversations, reflections, commentaries, courses, anything that you could need as you dive in and enter the Bible with curiosity and faith. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review or like and subscribe. And of course, the very best compliment you can pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. Until next time.